reception. Committee's out over Berlin, all right. Hold it there, skipper. Steady. Pumps low.
So this is a document that was in-house in the Air Ministry, and you can see the date on it is the 19th of December 1942. And if you look at the last paragraph, they're talking about the length of combat tours, and it says the Commander-in-Chief Bomber Command appears to be determined to press for the second tour. At that time, they were required to do 2 combat tours. And then the losses were so high, they were wondering whether or not they should continue doing this. There was a lot of question about what they were going to do. It says the attached table got by AMT, that's the Air Ministry training person, shows that the percentage chance of survival from 2 operational tours is 19%. Adding to this, the quite appreciable risk run during instruction on 2 operational training unit tours, the flow of personnel from their complete tour in Bomber Command is likely to be extremely small. In fact, without exaggeration, it might be termed almost suicidal. So this was all in response to what are we going to do with all these men that are completing their combat tours? And the answer is, well, we don't have to worry about it because there isn't going to be any.
Could you explain to us in terms of, in the U.S. bombers, they're doing 25 and they're done, but it's different in the RAF. Can you take a moment to kind of, because this document references that?
Yes. So the thing about it is that to my knowledge, there was no one in the Army Air Forces that really, they had a lot of men, they were training a lot of people, and so personnel was not really an issue with the Army Air Forces, even though they were losing, all of these men in 1942, 43, and then the losses went up, but the loss rate went down in 44 and into 45. But in the RAF, they were short of trained personnel. And so they didn't want to just have these men do a certain number of combat tours and then turn them back into, because all the air crew in both the Army Air Forces and in the RAF Bomber Command were volunteers. So the thing about it is that the RAF wanted to make sure they were going to get their money's worth out of them. In June and July of 1943, there was some question in the Army Air Forces about whether or not they were going to require personnel to do a second combat tour. What they did was they got around that by increasing the length of the combat tour from 25 missions. In March of 1944, they increased it to 30 missions. And in June of 1944, they increased it to 35 missions. But they never required, for the most part, personnel to fly 2 combat tours. But in the RAF, throughout the whole RAF, if you were in a combat squadron, you were expected to complete 2 combat tours.
With a training component of training new personnel sandwiched in there, correct?
That is correct. So if you go to the next slide, notice that this document was written on the 19th of December, 1942. If you go to the next slide, this is a chart that came out. And if you look down on the lower left-hand side, this was printed on January 4th, 1943. So this is only like 2 to 3 weeks after that last letter had been written. And this is the new chart using revised SD98. And you can see on the 3rd or 4th line down there, it says they have MAF. That's the Metropolitan Air Force, which was the Air Force that was flying out of England. The MAF only, based on SD98 rates on revised on operational experience. So what's happened is that they've got a new batch of information in there, and now they're looking at the statistical chance of surviving 1 and 2 tours for a variety of different types of aircraft. And at the very top, and this isn't the worst numbers out there, but at the very top, you can see that for heavy bomber, after one tour, now the odds of surviving are 16%. Remember in the previous document, they talked about the odds of surviving 2 tours was 19%. Here they're talking about 16% for one tour, and after 2 tours, your odds of surviving are 2.5%. Now, if you look at the bottom, it says most secret. They did not want this information to get out anywhere.
Staggering. 2.5%.
Yeah. And remember that, you know, a lot of this information was classified right up until the late 70s. So if you go to the next slide. So what do we know about RAF Bomber Command? Well, the way that the RAF operated was that they would have assign a squadron to fly with one unit, with one command, and lots of times they'd go to a different command. And lots of times a squadron that had lost a lot of men would be reassigned from Bomber Command to something like flying anti-submarine squadrons in Coastal Command, or they would be reassigned to the Mediterranean theater, or they would be sent to Southeast Asia to fly in the Pacific. But so during the war in Bomber Command in the RAF, there was a total of 134 squadrons that flew. And there's a fellow by the name of Charlie who's putting out in books on the losses, and he's listing the aircraft that were lost and the air crew of what happened to them. And he totaled up on the main force squadrons. That's the main operational forces. They called them the main force. They lost a total during the war of 12,330 aircraft. So when you add in the accidental and the training losses that they had that were also within Bomber Command, but they were in the operational training units and the conversion units, they lost a total of 14,338 aircraft. Now, we don't know how many men flew in these bombers. And so while we know in the RAF what the casualty rate was, we don't know what the survival rate was. And there's conflicting numbers all over the place. So the thing about it is I ask when I'm interacting with people from RAF squadrons and RCAF squadrons, do you have a roster of aircrew that served in your squadron? I've never been able to find one. Nobody seems to have kept track of it. And yet I've got battalion histories and regimental histories from the First and Second World War in the British Army and in the Canadian Army, where they have rosters of the men who served in that battalion or in that regiment. I'm sure you find a lot of the same thing in the American, histories. So the fact that nobody was tracking these men, to me that seems very odd. You would think that for reunion purposes and all that sort of stuff, they would want to know. And so this is one of the things that you start to ask yourself. Well, why did not the personnel records must be there, but it's just not easy to find for the average historian, and there's no official numbers. So if you could switch to the next slide. So this is what happens when you start looking at loss rates. Now, if you remember on the American, the 8th Air Force with 25 missions, at 10%, they had something like a 7% chance of surviving at a 10% loss rate. And that's pretty bad. That's, and like I said, in August to October of 1943, the 91st Bomb Group their loss rate was over 11%, and their survival rate was 5%. So when you look at what happened in the RAF in Bomber Command at different loss rates, because they had more missions that they had to fly, as you go up the level, excuse me, of losses, your odds of surviving get really grim in a hurry. So that the odds of surviving 50 operations at a 5% loss rate are roughly equal to surviving 25 missions at a 10% loss rate in the 8th Air Force. So this is all comes down to the mathematics of going out night after night after night, or 2 times a week or 5 times a month or whatever. That when the loss rate is a certain percentage, the chances of coming back as the loss rate goes up get very slim, to the point where you're looking at 8, 9, 10% losses for 2 tours, and your chances of survival are really nothing.
So when you referenced earlier the robustness of the design of the B-17 versus the B-24. Were there similar aircraft in the Royal Air Force Bomber Command that were more robust than the others? And yet, because at the end of the day, you talk about the mathematics of that, the impact is still devastating. Which then I guess my second question on top of that is how effective the enemy has become.
Yes, well, and this all bears in. Not only that, but the RAF never accepted the fact that they could get long-range escort fighters. So while Bomber Command was crying out for long-range escort fighters to help protect them, the Air Ministry refused to accept that such long-range escort fighters would exist. So they insisted on sending these bombers out night after night, month after month, against these horrendous loss rates, and so it becomes a little bit later in the talk, if we have time. I wanted to go over some of the stuff that Martin Middlebrook did, because he addresses this business of loss rates, and so like when you basically when it gets back to the aircraft, you were talking about the aircraft, that the Lancasters and the Halifaxes and the British bombers were designed as great big trucks, is basically what they were designed as. They were designed to carry large capacities of bombs, and they had a nominal defensive capability, but the defensive capability was woefully inadequate. Um, there's statistics that people like flying in Halifax, as Martin Middlebrook talks about this in his Bomber Command War Diaries, where people liked flying in Halifax is for one reason. When the aircraft was shot down, you had a 25% chance of getting out of the bomber, whereas in the Lancaster, you were down to 7 and 10%. Like the chances of getting out of these bombers was very, very difficult. The escape hatches to bail out were too small. They were equipped with 303 caliber machine guns as opposed to 50 caliber machine guns. They didn't have a belly turret, a ball turret, so when aircraft came in from underneath, they had no way of protecting themselves from it. They were just designed basically as great big buses that were designed to load up a lot of bombs and drop them, wherever they were told.
Wow. I had not heard that. That's good information, Jim.
Yeah, and like the information is out there, but it just takes a lot of digging. I mean, it's just